Orcs are one of the most fearsome, savage, insidious, and well-established races in the 41st millennium. They lack any empathy, even toward their own kind, and exist as a genetically engineered creation driven by instinct and a DNA-coded sense of purpose. They're created for one task and one collective goal only: to wage unending war. The Orcs are one of the oldest races in the 41st millennium, alongside the Eldar, both created by the ancient beings known as the Old Ones. The beings that would later become known as the Orks, or Krork in their original form, were a higher form of design alongside the Eldar, who possessed many levels of high intelligence. The Orcs are their exact opposite, operating on pure genetic instinct. Orcs and Greenskins in general, though, are not born from sexual reproduction. They're rather grown from spores, and all orcs are grown from the same spores and fungus, be they lowly snotlings and Gretchen or full-blown orc warriors. Once a planet becomes infected with orc fungus, either by chance or invasion, it will likely never be free again, having to forever defend against the unrelenting green menace. This infection is often likened to something like a terminal disease. Once a world is contaminated, it will surely be a case of when, not if, it will eventually wither and die. Orcs are enemies to all throughout the galaxy, but despite their crude and instinct-driven nature, they should never be underestimated. Defense against an orc assault can seem almost hopeless from the outset. For some human worlds, with all their strength and power they can wield to fight the orcs, it is nothing other than a war of attrition, a slow grinding down of morale and willpower. For a successful defense against any assault from the Greenskins only buoys their spirits and emboldens them further to attack again with more fury and more enthusiasm. They won't relent. They won't slow or surrender. There is no respite. There is no escape. A planet infected by the orc menace is a doomed world. Orcs possess a powerful genetic sense of being, to fight, to conquer, and to never surrender under any circumstances. Their strategies, we could call them that, are usually unsurprisingly simple and unashamedly direct. To overwhelm the enemy with sheer weight of numbers or absolute weapons superiority, to never show their enemies mercy, to smash and obliterate all who oppose them under an unrelenting green tide of ultra-violence. They wage war with machines that defy logic and technical understanding, and they care little for strategic gain. They seem to be just as likely to slaughter one another as they are the enemy, but most especially if an enemy is in their sights. Orcs are often reported to, for example, skewer one another with swords and other melee weapons, just so as to gain a killing blow on an opponent, crush their kin with their own vehicles with little if any regard, and use heavy weaponry without thought to such a thing as friendly. Casualties. Imperial forces are often left to wonder, how does one battle an enemy that defies all logic? And their answer is usually exterminatus. The orcs, as mentioned previously, are an engineered species. They were created some 60 million years ago by the Old Ones, who also created the Eldar and seeded life across the galaxy. The orcs were created, as were the Eldar, to wage war against the Necrons, the ancient enemy of the Old Ones. The orcs would refer to their creators as the Brain Boys. Now, while the Eldar were made to be highly intelligent with extremely powerful psychic powers so as to best counter the Necron and Citan threat, the orcs, then Krork, however, were the antithesis of the Eldar, muscle-bound, irrationally aggressive, and rarely showing signs of advanced intelligence. They're driven by designed instinct. To an orc, war and brutality are not desires. They're physical requirements for their identity. This is why they often fight amongst themselves as much as they would any outside races. While they do possess advanced tech, it is maintained by a class known as odd boys, who, as with all other orcs, are driven more by just a gut feeling, a born knowledge, than a true awareness of what they're actually doing. Unlike the Imperium of the 41st millennium, the odd boys possess the instinct of skill to not only maintain, but more importantly, to actually develop technology, if you can really call it as such. This skill isn't learned or researched by any conventional sense of tech development. It's instead bound into their genetics. As with all things orc, most of their skills are instinctive. The best way to really envisage this is for them to just smash things together until, by some miracle, it just works. A kind of deadly galactic scrap heap challenge, if you will. Orcs don't possess any random evolutionary psychic powers as humans might. And say, evolutionary if it's the old ones which have seeded life, but how it's by design. But nonetheless, the psychic power with orcs is comically random and, again, being by design from their creators, the old ones. This bizarre psychic power allows orcs to literally will something to be true. That if just enough of them believe it, then it will be so. For example, the classic painting "Their war machines a certain color" may imbue it with a power, like being more powerful with explosives or just to go faster, just because enough orcs will believe it to be so. With the proximity of numbers of them, it means it will become a reality. This enables orcs to achieve things like space travel, even controlling space hulks, and bringing them into real space under orc-modified control, a terrifying thought, as well as bringing huge war machines to a battlefield. All these things, by all rational logic, should be outside their realm of skill and possibility. And this genetic trait is also why orc technology, whilst essentially being just a random collection of things smashed together, will become devastatingly fearsome war machines in the hands of orcs, but then would just as easily return to being useless junk in the hands of other races. It's a clever solution to the threat of your war gear falling into the hands of an enemy. And again, this is by design of the old ones. Conversely, though, if orc numbers dwindle, then it can be potentially counterproductive. Unlike other races who can wield immense power reliably even in singular or small numbers, any number of examples would suit, from say Imperial assassins to Grey Knights and Eldar farseers. The more or less of their own race will not have a bearing on their success, their strength, or the functionality of their tech. Not so much with the orcs. The awareness of this psychic functionality came into general understanding through the Imperium's tech priests, who, through their own cultivated belief in a machine spirit that inhabits technology, and that this machine spirit serves mankind at the command of the machine god. This imbued them with a perspective and point of reference that enabled them to see the truth. How orcs were able to bring technology to the fore that should have been far out of their reach. Lastly, the orc race's anatomy is particularly interesting. The old ones obviously wanted the orcs, or Krork, to be functional as a warrior race, a biological war machine. But before you have the ability to wage war, you still have to fulfill any life form's basic needs, like sustenance, food, water, the basics of life. The old ones, in their wisdom, imbued the orcs with a powerful genetic advantage here, on top of their already many powerful genetic traits. For one, when it comes to food and liquid intake, the orcs can use their own growing fungus as a food source. They will happily eat pretty much anything, though. When it comes to meat and the lower orc forms of snotlings, they will cultivate this fungus food. The more interesting elements of their biology, though, is that orcs really are something like a symbiotic animal-fungus hybrid, making them partly eukaryotic in nature. Now, fungus was historically part of the plant kingdom, but fungi lack chlorophyll, the green pigment in plants that converts light energy to chemical energy. They also have other distinct structural and physiological features and are so classed separately from plants. Now, it has been suggested that orcs' green skin and their blood could directly contain chlorophyll so as to allow orcs to actually photosynthesize as a plant does, and thereby provide orcs with some energy so they can survive longer without actual food. Now, any problem? This makes absolutely no sense for the reasons they just mentioned. Fungi don't have chlorophyll. So if orcs grow and were cultivated as a plant-based life form in part, this would actually be more reasonable. But they're not. They're grown from fungi. So apparently, their generators may cause biologists of the Imperium should actually do some more microscopic comparisons before they reach their conclusions. However, it's also suggested that orcs in their blood and bodies may contain some sort of algae, and that this might be actually what's responsible for the coloration, and then also possibly the ability to photosynthesize to a degree. This is a more reasonable concept. But as with all alien races, information is pretty scarce, and speculation is abound. So this one point aside, other orc anatomical interests are that an orc's animal-fungal symbiosis means that they actually contain less critical organs than, say, a human, meaning orcs can afford to take wounds and damage that actually might kill a lesser creature, but it will allow them to continue functioning. Part of the reason they are so surely haphazard when in battle, almost careless, is their bodies are essentially designed to be simple, practical, and operate even when catastrophically damaged. Which rings true of everything we know about their purpose and their design. They were designed to be a biological war machine and nothing more. Orc growth, though, is a strange thing, whereby orcs will grow according to, I suppose unsurprisingly, how violent they are. They'll generally continue to grow at varying rates dependent on how successful they are in combat, be that versus other orcs or their enemies, and then their growth will stagnate again, music. Orcs live across a wide and scattered number of worlds throughout the galaxy, some in a state of war, some in endless skirmishes, and some dominating worlds, ruling them as overlords with often human slaves obeying their brutal command. The orcs' expansion was really an accident, as best known in orc history. Of course it was. This is why even now their settlements are often random, with no real pattern, focus, or direction. The Eldar claim orcs have become part of reality itself. Mankind has scouted, probed the galaxy, all of the known galaxy, and everywhere that they explored, they found the orc. The galaxy at this point is contaminated beyond any hopes of cleansing and salvaging it from the orc. Because of the random and haphazard fashion by which orcs discover, explore, and inhabit the galaxy, they have splintered into various communities, if you want to call them that. These communities are usually just a confederacy of tribes, either loosely or under a warlord. Each tribe is a random bunch of orcs just smashed together with clans and various mechs and materials. It's a mishmash of violence and construction. It's best not to overthink it. It bears no resemblance to any ordered sense of a community or a society. Orcs have known of mankind and their emperor for some time. They know that humans worship the emperor and have seen his shrines and symbols across human society. They regard the emperor as the god of the humans. And this is easy for orcs to understand, as they have their own gods. Even though they see humans as weak, they do respect the emperor as a powerful war god. From the orc point of view, the emperor is a constant warlord to the humans, They see him everywhere in human society, and so do the orcs. This widespread war god must surely be powerful and therefore to be respected. Some orcs speak of a legend where the emperor would appear as a manifestation, challenging the orc gods to battle. But still, despite this, he's also seen to the orcs as a confusing figure. Why he would command his human servants to take on so many pointless tasks when they could be just fighting makes no sense to the orcs. The humans' constant failures or their stress and despair seems to underline this confusion for orcs. Hence why they often use the word "humi" as a slang for things that are pointless, impractical, or just counterproductive. The orcs' attitude to life is very simple, and therefore they cope with the realities of the universe far better than many other races. With no overarching goals and day-to-day concerns being really only whether to build or fight or eat, it's quite a stress-free life, especially when you have no fear of your own mortality. From an orc point of view, generally speaking, they don't try to influence their own destiny. They don't try to apportion blame, unless it's some stupid Gretchen looking to get his head bashed in. Their hatred is spread equally among their enemies and their allies, and if they fail, they feel no guilt. Try again in a different way. Unlike humanity, chaos has little to any fear or effect with orcs. Their minds are hardwired to simple day-to-day activities, so dreams of power and turning against each other for some cause or something that's likely to spread very insidiously through a tribe of orcs. They're probably too busy already killing each other over some far more trivial matter. And because of their simple and, objectively speaking, stress-free lifestyle, it leaves little psychic stress by which chaos can actually invade them. Also, even though some races may look upon the orcs as evil, either due to their near-mindless savagery or their endless conquest of worlds, this is actually a pretty ignorant perspective. Lumping orcs in alongside dark forces like Chaos or Dark Eldar is really a disservice to the orcs, because they exist by design and they have become simply very effective at existing. They follow their instincts, and these are hard-coded into their very being. Evil? I don't think so, but brutally savage? Definitely. It's also often mistaken that perhaps if one were to see Chaos and Orc fighting on the same battlefield, that they are somehow an alliance. In reality, it's probably more simply that the Orcs just see them as other fighters on the field, who they'll probably turn to deal with in short order, once the nearer enemy to them has been battered into submission. Then, when it comes to trade, Orcs strangely do have this as part of their culture, and they use that literally, their teeth. It's actually a comically natural solution to economic inflation, because orcs go through their teeth similarly to something like a shark. They replace and regrow them frequently. Orc teeth also degrade over time, so it's impossible to stockpile them. This keeps prices in orc trading constant and ensures that all orcs have access to regular currency and commodities. And besides, if you're running short on teeth, it's no problem. You can just go smash some other orc's face in and get yourself some more. Orc language is deemed as being low Gothic, and orcs are able to communicate with others, but at a very basic level. Orc script, though, is very different altogether, and it's actually written in glyphs. The core of this is simple clan indicators, and these are then adapted using phonetic symbols, which can form some of the key orc words. It's pretty simple, though, because it's just generally not needed by the orc race. They function by design, not structure or organization. They have no need to keep records, log data, or any other useful societal function for writing and literature. These aren't important for orcs. The orc way is one of near anarchy. They're ruled by traditions and understandings much more than laws and governing. It's pretty simple. Orc society is about conflict. Strong orcs will rise up, weak ones will work or are killed, and they in turn benefit from the leadership of the stronger orcs. If an orc tribe is beaten by a stronger one, the survivors gain the leadership of a better tribe, making them stronger. And there's no rules about a tribe's size, location, or purpose. It's just the rough grouping of orcs in a given area at a given time. And each is led by a warlord whose authority is pretty loose, giving just maybe enough rule to prevent all the orcs from turning on each other. A tribe could be a few hundred strong, a few million. The literal numbers are not important. Large tribes usually split into smaller groups of warbands, which are ruled by war bosses, and these warbands are usually a few hundred strong, creating smaller forces ready to battle wherever it's necessary or whenever they feel like it. While orcs will belong to a tribe, they also will belong to a clan. Now, a tribe may break apart into parts or form new ones, but clans are enduring and remain a reasonable constant from an orc point of view. Some of the most noted orc clans are as follows. The Bad Moons. These are some of the most wealthy orcs. They're essentially what could be regarded as the merchant caste in orc society. The Blood Axes were the first orc clan to encounter the Imperium of man, and they adopted human tactics of camouflage, albeit slightly bright camouflage, and usually for orcs. They're sometimes known to retreat, having picked this up also from humans, but they're usually returned and in greater numbers. This clan will sometimes even trade with humans, even having been known to work as mercenaries for them, which sounds crazy but may be uncomfortably necessary. The Deathskulls are essentially looters and scavengers. They appropriate battlefield loot to make themselves stronger, including Imperial war gear. The Evil Sons, orcs who are committed to speed, and whatever makes them go fast should be as loud as possible. They also love flying vehicles like fighters, fighter bombers, and they usually seem to wear at least some red material, because as all orcs do know, the red ones go faster. The Goffs. The Goffs are simply tough orcs. They're the biggest, the most brutal. They thrive on battle more so than others, and they're driven by the blood fury of close-quarter battle. The Snakebites worship ancient traditions over advanced tech. They protect themselves with war paint, and may even choose to remain as feral orcs instead of developing their skills with mechs and guns. Finally, the Freebooters. These are the pirates. These orcs are notorious thieves, preying upon anything or anyone that they find. They'll kill anybody they see. They'll seize upon, hold their booty back to their hidden bases. So now we go to orc religion. Whether intentional or not, the old ones ended up imbuing the orc with a religious sensibility. They worship two gods, Gork and Mork. One is brutal and cunning, and the other is cunning and brutal. Gork and Mork are the center of orc energy. They drive and power their whole culture. The best idea we have of how the orcs perceive their gods is in their mechs. These are the physical manifestation of their gods and drive their followers into stupefying frenzies of violence and bloodlust. They are also seen in armored battlesuits, Gorkanauts and Morkanauts. These armored suits are seen as idols, and the orcs piloting the suits, gripped with visions of their gods urging them to fight on harder, faster, more brutally, and inevitably to meet their demise on the battlefield. While orcs often talk of Gork and Mork as separate entities, it's even possible they are one, perhaps with two sides or provide different visions to different orcs. Still, It doesn't stop the Orks from often favoring one or the other, being known as either Gorkers or Morkers. One figure in the Imperium knows more of Gork and Mork than most others. He's Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders. He's what's known as a perpetual in the 40k universe. Essentially, he's an immortal. He can regenerate from almost any injury, even something like being vaporized. Vulcan disappeared after the Horus Heresy, but he would appear some 1,500 years later on the imperial world of Caldera to aid in defending it against a massive Ork invasion. Now, though he died many times over, he would regenerate and appear again on the front lines. The Imperial Inquisition requested he lead a mission to destroy the Ork war boss known as the Beast, but Vulcan refused until Caldera was saved. With the aid of Imperial forces, Vulcan saved Caldera from destruction and returned to Terra, gathering an Imperial force to Ulanor, to the homeworld of the Beast. Vulcan would lead the final charge into the Beast's massive temple Gargant, confronting the war boss there. During a powerful struggle, the Primarch and the war boss would fall into the Gargant's power generator, and Vulcan created a detonation in the generator so powerful it killed not only the Beast, but a massive chain reaction, shattering the temple Gargant and obliterating them. Vulcan presumed dead by the Imperium, but the Salamander's space marines still hunt for him, believing him indestructible and that he will return to them. And the point of this story was what Vulcan would witness in the heart of the Ork Gargant when exposed to its powerful generator. He witnessed the raw energy that was the culmination of all the Ork Waaagh, and he would witness the origins of the Orks and their gods Gork and Mork battling one another at the beginning of time. This powerful vision allowed Vulcan to understand the true nature of the Orks, how they are a race of evolution through experimental anarchy, music. Now, the Orks have been an ever-existing threat to the Imperium of man, but towards the end of the 41st millennium, there's been seen an explosion in Ork war. The Ork Dominion or Empire marks the regions in the galaxy currently controlled by the Xenos. Some planets are now completely controlled by the Ork race, where others are in an unending state of brutal, nightmarish, and near-hopeless war. Orks have been known to keep under control some of the local populace, creating a prison workforce who are kept in unbearable, exhausting, and dangerous conditions, abiding by their uncaring, savage slave masters. Most of these prisoners will be unlikely to ever know any other life than being subject now to the Orks' brutal will. The Orks will at any time also control random isolated worlds, as well as rampaging hordes that sweep through the galaxy, battling all that they encounter. They have also been found inhabiting ancient space hulks. Now, as an aside, a space hulk is simply a term given by the Imperium of man to any ancient wreck of space vessels. These hulks are no mere freighters or even warships, but giant ancient vessels, possibly from the early exploration of mankind, or even lost in the age of strife. They can be so massive as to even maintain their own gravity, or in rare cases, atmosphere. The hulks can often appear and disappear, transitioning between the warp and normal space. This makes exploring them extremely dangerous. As well as Orks, they often can host other dangers like genestealer cults. Tyranids who have been found often using these hulks as breeding grounds for their genestealers. Even Chaos Space Marines can sometimes be found there, either searching for ancient tech or preparing to launch hidden attacks against the Imperium. While there is great potential reward in searching a space hulk, there's also immense danger, coupled with the ambient danger of the hulk's own instability. As such, searching these vessels is left to the elite warriors of the Imperium and the Space Marines. the Space Marine Terminators. They're some of the most heavily armored units within a Space Marine chapter, and their ancient Terminator armor enables them to carry out the extremely dangerous task of searching the hulks. Now, humans have explored extensively in the 41st millennium, and they have found orcs to inhabit every corner of the galaxy. And this seems unlikely to change now or in the future. The orcs are not a race of reason or diplomacy or even needs. They exist as a genetically engineered creation of instinct and a DNA-coded sense of being. They spread across the galaxy more like a plague than conquerors. This plague of war is often referred to as the Waaagh. What conflicts usually will remain localized to their own planets, or objectively speaking, small raids to worlds inhabited by other races or other orc or pirate-like raids on passing ships. Again, as with most things that orcs do, there's usually not a grand plan here, so don't overthink it. A Waaagh, however, is a different happening altogether. When numbers of orcs reach a critical mass, they feel a need to migrate, to form a crusade of apocalyptic aggression that will sweep through a region, destroying anything in its path. Numbers of orcs are beyond estimation. Then they'll swarm through a segmentum of space, exterminating everything in that path. You could liken this to a locust plague or a viral pandemic until it eventually burns itself out. Waaagh also refers to a psychic field that affects all psyker. This is again, as with all things orc, an instinctive state, enabling them to make simple observations of understanding. This applies to everything from the designation of seniority, which again, don't overthink that. It's usually more akin to who is just bigger and therefore more right. Orcs generate this dull psychic field by default. It binds them together and helps their ramshackle culture function. The more orcs that are present, the stronger this shared psychic field becomes, and this is amplified through sheer numbers, or if they say, are enjoying a really good bit of crumpin' and smashing their enemies' faces in. The Waaagh helps drive them, and you could think of it as being akin to momentum. We're past a point, it's just going to increase. A Waaagh can begin on a small scale. Sometimes there's a small individual who may have some vision of great carnage and feel inspired to share with others, by crumping their heads until they get it. Or if he's imbued with a sense of tech skill. Maybe he's going to create some giant Gargant war machine that gets the blood and hype of his fellow orcs running high. The rumors of war and coming carnage spread like wildfire to the orcs, only exacerbating this sense of war. An orc war boss, who is simply a big, powerful orc in command of his tribe, will usually rise to their aspired position through just basically beating the hell out of all around them until fellow orcs just get it that he's the biggest and the strongest. His decisions will be enforced by a ruling caste of orcs known as knobs, and these are again a bigger-than-normal orc, who will surely remind those below them of the fact at every opportunity with some casual violence. A war boss in a time of Waaagh will assert himself through unsurprisingly more savage, senseless violence towards his fellow orcs. When a war boss has created enough blunt trauma to be recognized as a powerful boss, he'll then be deemed an orc warlord. As his status spreads, more and more clans will come under his control, growing an unrelenting green mass of aggression. The mechs and weird boys will build ever more outlandish creations, absurd in their brutality and genius in their creativity. Vicious war machines, belching smoke and oil, poisonous vapors, acrid smoke. Mobile fortresses, titanic war engines created from basically random scrap metal and abandoned, twisted, now cannibalized war engines. As the war boss grows ever stronger toward becoming the warlord, he'll subsume his challengers' armies, with many of the orcs now seeking the sense of war in the bloodthirsty insanity. Mekboys raise towers of Waaagh, and Gargants will start to be seen. Gargants are the equivalent of Imperial Titans, and so represent a world-ending level of firepower. These Gargants are idols or seen as avatars to the orc race, as manifestations of their gods, Gork and Mork. They are merciless weapon assemblies of sheer destruction. Gargants form no standard pattern of design, as does barely anything in the orc way of creation. They are instead a random collection of parts and combinations of cannibalized war machines. This excitable and chaotic nature of these builds makes their weapon systems unreliable. Their whole design is haphazard and probably about as dangerous to the crew as to their targets on the battlefield. A clear difference between most orc machinery and other races in the galaxy is they don't utilize guidance systems commonly. They also carry large crews of orc and the lower, smaller race of Gretchen, and they operate these war machines as a team, passing down orders as you might imagine a steamship of, say, the 19th century, calling down orders to the engine room and so on. Gretchen are significantly physically smaller than orcs, and so are used to repair systems on the go by crawling into tight spaces. Gargants are usually weaker in terms of armor compared to Imperial Titans and relatively shorter range of weaponry. However, they're still difficult to destroy because of the compacted, dense nature of their construction. There is one rare variety above a normal Gargant known aptly as a mega Gargant, and this is essentially a mobile fortress running on tracks. Imperial tales tell of orcs laying siege to cities, spending even as long as 18 months to construct these colossal machines of war. Returning to the apocalyptic war, the continuous swelling of orc mobs starts to reach a critical mass. Ships and transport vessels are smashed together, and the orc armies reach a point of no return. This wave of violence now comes crashing down as the orc armies, overflown with bloodlust, descend into battles that consume entire worlds. The Gargant idols further trigger the instinctive drives of the orc clans and tribes, who would do anything to outdo each other's destructive capabilities. At some point, this wave of fury and raging violence reaches its boiling point, and the orcs begin to gather their great Waaagh army, the ground shaking under the weight of tracked vehicles and striding walkers. The skies turned black from flyers belching out blackened exhausts and their ragged banners of brutality, raising high atop these rusting, illogical contraptions of war. Orc Waaghs are very decentralized and have very little true coherency, even with a powerful war boss or warlord overseeing things. Various fragmented factions will exist in a Waaagh. Cults of speed, for example, whose principle is to go fast, essentially speed freaks who love the thunderous roar of an engine, and, if they can shoot some guns at the same time while they're probably driving over and crushing some of their own kind in the process. Stormboys are elite shock troops who strap huge rockets on their back to make sure they're first into battle, charging with no thought much to the consequences. This is actually frowned upon by many orcs, as they prefer to charge in under their own feet. They get physically into the battle. Still, seeing a Stormboy's volatile rocket pack malfunction, those spinning off into an exploding disaster, certainly killing the pilot in the process, is great entertainment for the comrades on the ground. And then, of course, you've got the Mekboys. These are orcs overwhelmed by the psychic energy of Waaagh. And they also can occur in clans of orcs inhabiting a planet and have to develop their own technology over generations of spawned orcs. Either way, Mekboys don't coexist well with their kin. They're essentially best described as feral, which is saying something by orc standards. These feral, crazed orcs, also known as nutters, are grouped together into squads who will either be a secret tool to success when unleashed on the enemy, or a hindrance when they accidentally slaughter any fellow orcs they happen upon. Once combat begins, Mekboys can still be some of the most savage fighters to an orc foe or fellow orc alike, ripping them to pieces. Still, they're just as likely as sitting in a whimpering huddle, unable to move, overwhelmed by psychic confusion. No orc can tell exactly how they're going to behave, and making them an unpredictable and extremely dangerous force to bring onto the battlefield. Along with their crudely smashed-together spaceships and space hulk infestations, orcs have even been reported to convert asteroids into massive space fortresses known as the uncreatively titled rocks. The orc species is one of the most adept at making the best of their surrounding materials. And this is the genius and danger of their design. The old ones created the orcs with only two things in mind: making them deadly and to make them near impossible to exterminate. Orcs are a plague upon the galaxy, to be sure, but not because of their skill in battle or because they spread insidious ideologies. They're simply because they're so difficult to truly eradicate. Humanity, for all of its technology and experience, often must resort to planetary exterminatus to be truly sure of destroying an orc infestation. Orcs defeat their enemies by either overwhelming them or wearing them down to a point of collapse through continuous losses in personnel and materials, simply by attrition. Orcs operate from a Waaagh, antithesis of ordinary warfare. Usually, any force will seek out decisive victories, utilizing minimal resources and seeking to limit casualties. Orcs, on the other hand, seek no limitation in casualties or resource management. They have no control over this but to burn as hard and as fast as possible. And even when defeated, they will return to grind down whatever crumbling defenses remain of their enemy. Music. Now, there are many individual stories and tales of orc warlords and bosses, as there are within the Imperium and its various leaders, captains in general history, in all culture and history. You can't speak of the orcs without mentioning the warlord Ghazghkull Thraka. He's an orc warlord of the Goff clan and is an immense symbol of everything orc. Now, despite orcs being generally an anonymous mass of anarchy, he stands out as a powerful leader. He's commanded multiple campaigns and crushed most, if not all, in his sights, be they Imperial, Eldar, or Chaos, smashed the metal skulls of the Necrons into brittle scrap. He has influence above that of any ordinary orc warlord and is often described as a prophet of their gods. He travels the galaxy, subjugating, slaughtering, and burning the enemies of the orc. His vision is to wage a war so immense as to summon the gods out of the immaterial and into the physical realm, and he enacts their will. But his beginnings were nothing of note, just another orc crumping other orcs' brains to climb up the ranks, and originating on a planet known as Urk, originally Urkles, founded by humans during the dark age of technology. Humanity prospered here, rich in mineral wealth and with easy warp tides flowing for space travel. It was an excellent trade hub. Lights and noise attract attention. Resources make good mechs, and the orcs would become aware, attacking with a voracious assault. The orcs would raise the planet before riding back into the warp tides. As with nearly all orc assaults, the departure is not as clean as it appears to be. They'd leave behind fungal spores, and the orcs would return in time. Other species would periodically form outposts on the planet. Sometimes the orcs would rise up, other times not. Sometimes they'd be destroyed, sometimes not. It wouldn't be until the great crusade of mankind, though, that any humans would return here in numbers. The Dark Angels' Space Marine Legion would lay claim to the world, and for 2,000 years, humanity would build, mine, and establish a functioning order on the reinstated world of Ercles. That was until around the 32nd millennium, when a great orc Waaagh swept through the system. Humans were overwhelmed again and evacuated, fleeing into the warp. But its tides destabilized, and Ercles would be cut off and not easily reached by outside influence again for about 8,000 years. The orc tribes, however, remained, battling one another and fighting over the human ruins that remained. A state of genuine attrition was reached, with various warbands fighting over ever-diminishing resources, none of them able to unite under a single leader. Then came Ghazghkull. One thing the Imperium learned about the orcs, though, was that their Waaghs could be quashed if detected early enough. The Imperium would begin to deploy observation posts so as to best detect and monitor orc numbers and activity. The Dark Angels monitored this as well, as they've routinely monitored human populations for potential recruiting planets. After the warp tides had calmed, the Dark Angels were able to establish one such outpost on Urk so as to monitor this well-occupied orc planet. The orcs, however, desperate for any loot and resources, managed to discover this observation post, and it was quickly overrun. At this time, Ghazghkull was just a boy in a warband, and during the frenzy to claim the base, he would be shot in the head by a bolter shell, a devastating injury that would shatter his skull and pulp a section of his brain. Staggering back to his feet with immense toughness, he drew the respect of orcs around him, especially Goffs. Despite being a physical wreck, staggering and stumbling, his blood and brain spilling out into his own hands, they eventually found their way to a doc who would perform what I guess orcs deemed to be an operation. As is often the way with orcs, this was less of a repair and more an improvement, an augmentation, and probably a bit of an experiment. Ghazghkull found that his skull and brain were now strengthened with bionics, squigs, and adamantium plating. These physical alterations were great, to be sure, but nothing compared to the vision he would see awakening from this augmentation. He would see a vision from Gork and Mork themselves, to lead orcs in the greatest, most destructive, and carnage-reaping Waaagh that there had ever been. It was his soul core belief that he had been in direct contact with his gods, and he was the chosen leader and the executor of their commands. That his brain got poked by a bolt gun round through the skull. Either way, his purpose was clear, and his resolve strengthened. And as is often the way in orc culture, the whys and wherefores, it's the actions that count. And Ghazghkull's actions would be notable. Orc warlords began to fall immediately under his crushing will. The Deathskull's warlord, Dreg Mek, with Ghazghkull barely minutes out of his surgery, the Deathskull's warlord would attack, unleashing a bullet storm that left Ghazghkull untouched by perhaps godly intervention. Dreg Mek could not believe his eyes as Ghazghkull would stride forward, beating him into a bloody pulp, headbutting and smashing into pieces as his mobs looked on, some getting carried away in the violence and even cheering Ghazghkull on. Roaring from his victory, Ghazghkull declared himself the prophet of Gork and Mork, and that this was his mere beginning. The word of Ghazghkull's brutality and power spread fast, and orcs flocked to join a band with a sense of purpose and direction, to be something more than the pitiful squabbling and clamoring for scraps that they've become. The tales of a new boss touched by the gods with a vision for war was very appealing. His further battles with the evil suns and bad moons would be no less aggressive but required more tactical sense, using burning fuels to shield his troops' approaches or outwitting wards through their sense of pride. For that disposition, he was placed as an inevitable leader. His subjugation of other warlords continued until he stood poised to do something no orc had done in 8,000 years: unite the tribes on the planet of Urk. His domination of the planet was unquestioned, but the Ghazghkull had set his sights far beyond bringing together the orcs inhabiting his world. His words drove the orcs to their purpose. The Waaagh beginning to form, their energy attracting others. Void ships began to arrive for the first time in centuries. Mechs worked together, building machines they never could have imagined previously. But now, with the energy and the power of the Waaagh, it all just worked. It was a miracle. The orc energies flowed as they riveted together giant battle fortresses and mechs. Everything that occurred was the will of Gork and Mork. And Ghazghkull would declare every passing day, every achievement, every new ship arriving proved their quest was divine. Some of the orcs were wondering how they were going to get so many of the orcs off the planet. They didn't have very many flyers and no large ships to transport and begin their war. Ghazghkull quickly silenced them. A solution would present itself. It was the will of Gork and Mork. Days later, the ever-unpredictable tides of the immaterial would shift again, and that rarest of occurrences would happen. A gigantic ancient space hulk would emerge from the warp. Ghazghkull ordered tractor cannons and harpoon rockets on the few spacecraft that they had to secure the hulk. They couldn't guess as to how long before the warp would swallow the ancient ship, even with them holding it in place, and they needed to work fast. The orcs rushed to assist in construction. They crafted as many transports and war machines as possible. Once they deemed enough was enough, they crammed as many orcs into every possible space and set off. This great exodus from their backwater planet filled the skies, not without many mid-air collisions and engine failures as well, to be sure, crashing into the space hulk's outer hull. Some managed to make their way inside, some straight on plowed into the vessel, and those with more sense sought out landing positions. The orcs discovered that they weren't alone on the space hulk, with wave after wave of demons spilling out of its corridors. Battling through the horrors, Ghazghkull and his band fought through to the center of the hulk, where they found, merged and jumbled by the warp, was the ship, the Dominion. This was the vessel the humans had attempted to flee from the planet on some several thousand years ago, and seemingly it had been swallowed by the warp, its human occupants devoured by the demons as they lay trapped in their vessel. The void rift that was spilling demons had to be closed, but Ghazghkull, after ordering his orcs to fight everything they had, was furious to discover it had no effect. His own weapon, even his own power claw, eventually, with a massive headbutt and a flash of green light that did the job, closing the demonic portal. It seems likely his latent psychic energy was what affected this closing. Before the orcs observing it was only further imbued their belief that this warlord was a force like no other. Ghazghkull now named his conquered space hulk the old warship Wrecker. The ship would drift on for an undetermined period of time, in which the orcs would explore, loot, and generally rip off whatever they could find on board, cannibalizing the ship and using its materials to craft ever more powerful mechs and weapons. They appropriated everything they could lay their hands on and built everything they could lend their hands to. The best scrap would often lead to infighting and rivalry, all a positive thing for the orcs to keep their tensions and blood up. It would not be a quiet period, though. Traveling through the warp in such an unsecured vessel is dangerous, and many times they'd be assaulted by further demonic incursions, and these assaults only further heightened the Waaagh energy into the entire space hulk seething with orc energies. the space hulk jolted, and huge tremors swept across the ship. The wrecker had shifted back into real space. Imperium records date the emergence of the space hulk in the year 941.M41. They were headed for the core planet of the star system, an imperial world aptly named Armageddon, an industrial hive planet where thousands of years of extensive industry had left it a barren wasteland with a totally collapsed ecosystem. Humans only survived in the concentrated hive cities that stood kilometers tall, and also in the imperial military facilities stationed there. Food needed to be imported off-world, and no life existed outside of the hives. It contained multiple vast manufactorums vital to munitions supplies for the Astra Militarum, but with one of the most savage and relentless Waaaghs ever seen headed straight for them, it seemed like nothing was going to be able to stop the wrecker and its crew. The ship would head straight for the planet without stopping. The plan? There wasn't a plan. They would crash straight into the planet. Ghazghkull was literally on a collision course with his destiny. Caught off guard, nearby Imperial fleets and the planet's defenses did what they could to slow the assault. But this only chipped away at the massive space hulk that approached, taking minimal effective damage. It plowed straight into the planet's polluted atmosphere, crashing with obvious devastation onto its surface. Even though many thousands of orcs would be turned to ashes on impact, this is but a tiny percentage of their total force. To the survivors, Ghazghkull seized this opportunity. "It is the will of Gork and Mork that we survive," he would proclaim. The orcs, now twice as pumped up having survived their world-ending crash into the planet, would be a force none would wish to reckon with. And Ghazghkull quickly divided his massive army into 5 hordes, with leaders that he'd subdued and recruited to his cause back on Urk. They now stepped forth, millions of orcs, but one voice. The human defenders weren't prepared for this. They had many forces, walkers, and munitions. But the sheer scale of the violence and ferocity they were met with was of nothing they dreamt of in their worst nightmares, which, in the 41st millennium, is certainly saying something. This was not an ordinary orc Waaagh. This was Ghazghkull's Waaagh. The orcs showed, expectedly, no mercy at any instance, and they defeated the humans on the wastelands with their speeders and battle wagons, ruined enemy supply lines, and cut down anything that moved. And they quickly turned their attention to structures that they had never seen before. These hive cities, taller than mountains, industry and engineering on an imperial scale. The mechs stood in awe. "So much scrap," they would have murmured. At the first hive they encountered, despite the Imperium putting up a formidable defense of Hive Vulcanus, heavily fortified, this would take all of Ghazghkull's cunning. He had his Gargants, but he wanted to take this city with orcs on the ground, scorching, burning, and reaping through the trenches. Mechs would smash, crush, and break this city. Using his visionary choices of units, Ghazghkull crushed the human defenses quickly, and breaking the gates, unleashing a wave of infantry. His will was executed perfectly, a tall order for an orc Waaagh. Desperate humans resorted to guerrilla warfare. But despite much heroism, the orcs swept through like a plague, slaughtering and enslaving its occupants. His manufactorums were quickly converted to orc workshops. Human slaves turned to stripping their own city for every scrap of resource that could be used to fashion more orc mechs. Now, on the planet of Armageddon, one human stood out from the general perception of the orcs as a weak and puny race: Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. He drew unusual respect from the orcs, not least because he wore Goff colors of the black and red, but also sporting an augmented power claw and bionic eye. This was a human the orcs could get on board with. Even more so when they learned from enslaved humans that they often feared Yarrick as much as they feared their other enemies, the Eric known for shooting disobeying soldiers out of hand. Orcs, upon seeing him in battle, were often disappointed to see he wasn't quite as big as they'd imagined. He was only a human-sized figure. Oh well. He was an uncompromising warrior nonetheless. Yarrick was the man credited with withstanding the orc assault on Hive Hades for a significant period of time. This assault brought the Armageddon War to a new level of brutality. The orcs had already sacked 2 Hive cities, and Hades stood next in line. The Imperium, in desperation, would launch virus bombs, devices not used since the time of the heresy, against the orcs. And even though hundreds of thousands of orcs would perish, it wasn't enough. Ghazghkull wanted Hades, and he would direct the assault himself. He tried everything he could think of, growing ever more frustrated all the time. But all his traditional assaults would fail time and time again. Eventually, he summoned his weird boys to use their Waaagh consumed minds to blast a psychic storm at the Hive. Consumed by madness, the human defenders fell apart, but still the humans couldn't be defeated. The orc flyers were ripped apart by anti-aircraft fire. Tunnel fighters cut their orcs trying to advance underground to pieces, and human suicide assault squads took down the immense orc Gargants. All this would be Commissar Yarrick's doing. Ghazghkull by now had become fixated and obsessed with bringing down Hive Hades, his vision and judgment clouded by the frustration and needing to bring it down. While still battling this bitter assault, he would direct an all-out assault on another Hive city, Acheron, perhaps in the hope to divert resources away or gain a victory and rally his troops to greater energy. But then the worst possible development for the orcs. Orbital bombs rained from the sky as roaring space marine thunderhawks would sweep down into the planet. The Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders, the Emperor's chosen warriors, were here to defend Armageddon. Ghazghkull was still so blinded by fury in his efforts to defeat Yarrick and Hades, he was unable to think with clarity enough to counter the arriving Space Marines. He would throw everything he had to take down his obsession, breaking in the blast doors of Hades in a final rampage. The Space Marines would be too late to save Hive Hades, its citizens massacred. With Ghazghkull's numbers now though severely depleted and loosely scattered across the planet, he consolidated his last reinforcements to a new hive. Tartarus. The planet stood at a crossroads. Even with the arrival of the Space Marines, they would deploy even as the orcs began their assault, with mech stompers and even Gorkanauts. The battle, though, was not in the orcs' favor, but then Ghazghkull himself arrives. The orcs could taste things returning for them. But then, just as quickly as he arrived, he'd gone. Chatter spread quickly through the orcs. The war boss had fallen. They began to waver, to break, and the Imperium crushed the remaining orcs, driving them from Armageddon. But the orcs thinking Ghazghkull had fallen in battle was not so. Ghazghkull was not slain, but he did disappear from the battlefield. Rumors spread that the hand of Gork had plucked him from the battlefield, and his detractors would say fled, usually to be met with a swift headbutt from a nearby orc putting them in their place. However it did happen, Ghazghkull had escaped. After Armageddon, Ghazghkull did not rest. As with most orcs, defeat is not really a thing. It's just a stumble, a setback, the chance to have another go. This was the beginning for him in his larger journey, a plan of Gork and Mork. Yarrick recommended the Imperium hunt down this brutal war boss and eliminate him once and for all. But the Imperium assumed him dead or defeated and didn't want to spend the resources or time to locate an orc they were sure that that was the last they'd see of. This was a grave error of judgment, as is often the case with most things in the Imperium. To the Imperial mind, his Waaagh had failed, and therefore, even if he did survive, orcs would not look upon him for leadership with his energy deflated after losing a battle. While orcs will happily try again, they'll often topple their leader, as is their natural order of things. But not so with Ghazghkull. While he may have had to defeat several challenges in brutal fashion, after he regrouped with various orc tribes to remind them just who he was, he would begin gaining new followers again. Curiously, for an orc, not just with his actions, but with his words. To him, the invasion of Armageddon had been a starting point, a testing of the enemy to find their strengths and their weaknesses. A large-scale intelligence gathering, orc-style, leaving millions dead and burning cities in its wake. And in this, they gained much useful information. Now Ghazghkull knew about Imperium strategies. He would regroup, rebuild, and restore his prophetic Waaagh. He would reveal to his fellow orcs, in order to destroy your enemy, you must know him too. To the orcs, this is about as profound as it gets, and their spirits would reignite. The second coming of Ghazghkull Thraka was only a matter of time.